My name is Matt Blois. You're listening to Medically Necessary, a show about the healthcare supply chain. I talk with experts, business leaders, and researchers about how we get drugs, devices, and medical supplies to healthcare providers and patients. The show is brought to you by Ryder, the only fully integrated logistics and transportation provider in the industry. Ryder's solutions cover the entire supply chain, including warehousing, transportation logistics, e-commerce fulfillment, and last mile. Discover how Ryder can make you ever better at ryder.com. So today I'm talking with Sandy Murty, Vice President of Global Partner Development at Impinj. Impinj uses RFID tags to track products in a whole wide variety of industries, including healthcare. So RFID tags are these tiny chips. You can attach them to objects for quick and easy identification. These are the same tags that you might implant in your dog so that your neighbor can return it to you after it escapes, or you might have used it in a hotel key to get access to your room. In healthcare, hospitals use RFID tags to track the location of medical equipment or keep tabs on supply levels for personal protective equipment or other supplies. And during the coronavirus pandemic, some hospitals have been using Impinj's technology to track COVID-19 vaccines as well. But Impinj also says that they can use this technology to provide better visibility into the healthcare supply chain in general by providing information about the availability of necessary products like drugs before they start running short. So Sandy, thanks for joining me on the show today. Can you start by just giving me a specific example of how your company's technology gets used in healthcare?
Sure thing, Matt, and thanks for having me. So a super specific example, and you touched on the COVID-19 vaccine tracking so I'll just use one of those examples since it's so timely. One of our partners, IntelliGuard actually, developed a solution that Rady Children's Hospital in Southern California used when the vaccination drive first started now a few months ago here in the US, and they were vaccinating their healthcare workers. Their staff at the hospital used a cabinet enabled with RFID technology from Impinj to track the vaccine stocks that the hospital had, tracked who was accessing the medical cabinets, in which these are effectively refrigerators, as you know, where the vaccines are being stored, and also ensured that the vaccines were being used before they reached anywhere close to their expiration date. So that was a very specific way where the vials of vaccines were being tagged by these RAIN RFID tags that you referenced. The medical cabinet itself had readers built inside it that tracked vaccines as they were being put into the cabinet, as well as removed from the cabinet when they were being administered. And through that process and through that solution, the hospital was able to better keep track of what was obviously a very precious commodity when the vaccination drive started.
Yeah, well, and I think it's a perfect example. Just it's generating tons of information about, like you said, there are multiple levels of information you would want to know. You know, how many vaccines do you have? Who's been accessing them? Information about temperature control, information about the age and expiration. So all of that seems useful to if you're managing, the inventory of COVID-19 vaccines. Seems like really useful information to have. But what parts of it? So that that's sort of obviously COVID-19 vaccines did not exist until a few months ago. What, before the pandemic, which parts of the healthcare supply chain were most likely to use RFID tags? Like where would you be most likely to see these sorts of things in the healthcare supply chain?
Yeah, it's a good point, good question actually, because most of the places where we would see pre-pandemic, where we would see RAIN RFID technology from Impinj being used would usually be in the healthcare provider setting, so in hospitals, in clinics, and so forth. And within those settings, the two most common use cases within those settings would be for supply tracking, primarily high-value medications, high-value pharmaceuticals, controlled substances, and so on, as well as high-value medical assets within the hospital. So think defibrillators, infusion pumps, those sorts of devices that are obviously proliferate the hospital, sometimes are hard to find. And obviously finding those in a timely way is super important for delivering efficient healthcare. So those would be the primary examples. There's certainly other examples of use cases that I would say are more early stage, but those two categories are the most common places and ways in which the technology is used in healthcare today.
Yeah, and I guess what's the rationale behind that? Like, why those two categories?
Yeah, I think a couple of reasons. So RFID, so probably helps for context that prior to using RFID technology, specifically RAIN RFID technology for those use cases, the most common way of tracking supplies was usually, and is still today, barcode, right, on individual packages or doses of medication. The unique thing about RAIN RFID technology from Impinj is not only are the labels themselves very small in physical form factor, but because they are a passive RFID technology, they don't really need battery power on them. They can be affixed like a sticker type label to individual packages of medication. And they don't, unlike barcodes, they don't require line of sight to be read. As well, they can be read at very high volumes, over 1,000 tag reads per second in the case of many reading scenarios. So you put that combination of capabilities together, and then you think about some of the challenges in terms of labor cost, in terms of inaccuracy, in terms of human error when using either manual or barcode or other forms of keeping track of high volumes of medical supplies and pharmaceuticals. That's a natural kind of path that it takes you towards using or considering RFID technology to do many of the same things and do them a lot better. And like you said in the earlier point you made, get a lot more data about those supplies than you otherwise would get with barcoding type technology. In the case of assets, a very common type of technology is so-called active RFID technology. That typically requires batteries. The tags tend to be larger. They tend to be more expensive. They require more maintenance. They're just more complicated to maintain, if you will, because they are powered devices being attached to these medical assets. And again, for all the reasons I just mentioned, RAIN RFID technology, again, being a passive technology, not requiring battery power, you can imagine affixing these labels, these durable labels, onto medical assets. Sometimes these assets are very small, and active tags are not even an option for those. So for all those reasons, we've seen the uptake of these technologies growing and these types of solutions growing within that healthcare provider space.
Yeah, it totally makes sense. So on the one hand, it seems like a big part of it is automation, just reducing the amount of effort, but also reducing human error, and just keeping really accurate, keeping tabs on inventory levels accurately and easily. And then one of the other big pieces is, having that information, knowing the information is accurate, and having really up-to-date tracking of what's going on with inventory. And then also you mentioned the size of the tags a couple of times in that answer. And I didn't realize how small these were. You guys actually sent me a picture of how big the tags were. And I think the reference in there was a penny. So can you just explain how small these things are and kind of just give people a sense of the size there? Yeah,
it is pretty fascinating. So the chip itself that sits inside the tag, or what we call the tag or the label, lots of terms used interchangeably. The chip itself is a little bit smaller than a grain of rice, or the kind of the edge of a grain of rice. So the chip and very flat, obviously. Once it's converted into a tag, depending on the use case and the type of label that's desired, you can imagine something as small as a half-inch by half-inch sticker, all the way as large as and they get bigger from there because that chip is being attached to an antenna, and that antenna and chip combination is being encapsulated in some type of plastic or other type of material, depending on the use case required. So on a healthcare pharmaceutical package, it might be a very simple paper style sticker that's essentially adhering to the packaging of a dose of medication or on a vial of medication. For an asset, you might have something a little bit more durable, but it's still very small. So imagine a plastic encased label that's permanently attached to the back of an infusion pump, as an example. But you're right, they're very small relative to the capabilities that they deliver to their users.
Yeah. I just feel like that's good context to have in terms of thinking about what the potential use cases are and how you guys are using these things. So what do you think? You mentioned some of the ways that RFID tags have been used in the past, and then you also said there's a couple. You've got a couple of use cases that on your mind about things that are kind of an early stage. What do you think? What are some of those use cases where, or which parts of the healthcare supply chain do you think would benefit the most from adopting RFID technology? Like, what are the things we're not doing now that would be potential, have really big potential?
Yeah, I think in the near to midterm, I honestly think that there are parts of the supply chain upstream from the healthcare providers that could benefit quite significantly from the application of this technology. And what I mean by that is, by the time a medical device or a pharmaceutical product gets to a healthcare provider, obviously it's passed through manufacturing, distribution, and ultimately to the healthcare provider. And in most cases, those upstream organizations are not using RAIN RFID technology to the extent that the healthcare provider is. What that means is the only place in the supply chain that's getting the value of being able to individually identify a medical supply is that hospital. Now, if you think about the label or tag being applied at the point of manufacturing, or let's say the point of packaging is probably more accurate, the point of packaging of a medication or a vaccine or a high-value pharmaceutical, and then the ability, therefore, once that packaging has that unique identifier, for it to be tracked in an error-free, efficient, highly effective way all the way through that supply chain. You can imagine the level of supply chain visibility that could provide. And in the healthcare space, we all saw that not only was every industry disrupted by the pandemic over the last year and a half, but supply chains were particularly hard hit as suppliers and manufacturers and distributors and retailers all struggled with keeping up with very, very unpredictable levels of demand, unpredictable levels of supply. And in healthcare, the consequences obviously are very severe if you don't have the right supply in the right place at the right time. So I personally think that thinking about the healthcare supply chain holistically and applying this technology at the point of packaging, at the point of distribution, at the point of transportation, at the point of obviously the retail and ultimately even or dispensation at the provider site could provide a lot of value. And I believe the technology is there. We're starting to see early signs of these players starting to either run pilots or early projects to implement this, but that's a place I think ripe for innovation and adoption.
Yeah, well, yeah, and that's a theme that I hear constantly. Just in talking to various companies throughout this healthcare supply chain, just calls for more transparency and more people really want that visibility throughout the whole supply chain. And I thought it was interesting. You mentioned, the technology you feel like is there. It's not like we need some new science fiction type technology to make that work. But it feels like one of the big challenges there is sort of getting all of the different pieces of the healthcare supply chain to work together and say, we're going to share all this information because we think it's mutually beneficial. I don't know if that's necessarily like the role of your company to figure out how to do that, but I'm interested to know, like, what do you think? How do we get there? Like, who makes that happen, and how do they do it?
Yeah, it's a great point. I think, like all things in the healthcare industry, it usually takes a coalition of all these different organizations coming together to decide and work out and collaborate on what the best way is to implement a new process or new technology or a new solution that touches all these different players. And I think it's no different in this case. We've seen it play out in other types of technology waves of adoption within the healthcare industry that spans lots of different organizations and stakeholder groups and so on. I think we're seeing early signs of that happening here. And one of the reasons for that is, to use a very specific example that's particular to RFID, is the way in which a pharmaceutical is labeled and identified needs to be done in a way that every other stakeholder group within that supply chain can actually use that information. It doesn't help if a pharma manufacturer adopts one type of labeling and numbering scheme for their packages or their products, and then the distributor uses a different system, and the wholesaler maybe uses yet another system, and the hospital uses yet another system. That defeats the entire purpose of having some type of integrated, universal, at least universally understood and useful identifier. And I think that's just one example of, okay, all these different stakeholders need to come together, agree, and I think it makes it much easier, because then if you have that type of agreement or alignment, everyone can benefit from the investment required to actually do this, because now the benefits are accruing to everyone in that healthcare supply chain, because it's not any one company per se that has to only do one thing. It's the collection of companies needing to do a collection of things to make it all happen. And we're seeing industry groups like Dose ID that's recently been established, where we are seeing healthcare providers, technology providers, pharmaceutical companies, all kind of coming together to really kind of address this very specific issue.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And I'm also interested, because I mean, you guys have this technology that's all about sort of tracking where things are and building in that visibility. And obviously you've been doing that since well before the pandemic. And then I think over the last year, there's been, the spotlight put on visibility in the supply chain. And so I'm wondering, how do you think that conversation between all those different players has changed over the last 12 months? And does the pandemic sort of change the way that conversation progresses going forward?
Yeah, it's a fair question. I'm not in those conversations directly myself, as much as obviously those organizations are. But I'll share my opinion, which is I do think the pandemic has shined a spotlight on how badly things can go wrong from a supply chain perspective without the type of visibility, accuracy of supply levels across every part of the supply chain. And during the pandemic, we saw it for not just pharmaceuticals, but relatively simple things like PPE equipment or masks or things that cost very little, but the cost of not having those things in the right place or available for the right people to use was very high. And so oftentimes when people look at applying technology like RFID technology to do things like supply chain tracking and visibility, you often hear, well, I'm not going to put a X penny tag on a Y dollar item because it just doesn't make sense. And people think of it in those terms. The reality is the pandemic may have exposed, okay, it's not just the cost of the item, but what's the cost of the consequence of not having some of these items available when you need them. And it's one thing not to have that issue in the retail space. Okay, you don't know where a pair of jeans are or how many jeans you have in a given store. It's quite another thing in a pandemic environment to not know where those things are or how much of any particular item you have. So I do think it's shine that spotlight on these types of issues. Hopefully, it's a kind of rallying cry, if you will, for the industry to accelerate what the technology can already deliver today.
Yeah, well, I think that's a really interesting way to think about it. The cost. What is the cost of not having that thing because you didn't have the visibility there beforehand? It feels like maybe not the most intuitive way to think of, intuitive line on an Excel spreadsheet, but I think something that people are a lot more aware about now maybe than they were 15 months ago. So here's a broad question, but how do you think the use cases for RFID and healthcare are going to change over the next decade? Like where are we going to be in the future?
Yeah, well, wow. 10 years is a long time, but I'll take my best shot.
You can scale it. You can scale it down if you want to go down to 2 or 5. But,
maybe I'll think out. Yeah, I'll think out the next 2 to 5 years, Matt. And the things that I think about are beyond, and I'll cover things beyond the things we've already talked about. The things that I think about are all the, call them millions of items that the healthcare supply chain uses. We've talked about primarily today pharmaceutical products, but you think about things like surgical instruments. You think about supplies that maybe don't cost as much, but cost a lot of money in terms of tracking and keeping track of these. And this could be surgical gowns. These could be bandages. These could be, you take a peek inside a hospital supply closet and you'll see hundreds of thousands of different items of different costs and different uses. All of those things at some level, in my view, could end up getting tagged over the next few years with RAIN RFID technology to enable all the things we've been talking about: inventory visibility, better efficiency, better use of that, reduced wastage, and so reduce labor costs to track and keep count of all those things. So I think that's going to continue over the next few years as organizations continue to adopt the technology. The other side I think about are, those wristbands you get if you're admitted to the hospital and they put around your wrist, and they typically have a barcode on there, and those barcodes are used for a variety of different things when a patient is in the hospital. Well, imagine having a RFID-based label inside that wristband, and now think about everything from keeping track of your patients within the hospital, when you're administering medications to a patient, being able to be alerted, a nurse being able to be alerted when they walk into a room and maybe they've got the wrong medication. The medication has a tag on it. The patient has a wristband tag on it. The room is monitored with RFID technology. And if for whatever reason, maybe the patient is allergic to that medication, maybe their medical record indicates that they're not supposed to be getting that medication. Again, errors unfortunately happen. But imagine proactively being able to be notified as a healthcare professional of those sorts of things. Today, it's typically either done through manual verification of some kind or barcode-based verification of some kind. But those are the types of workflows I think about that can proliferate the use of technology across the healthcare setting. And then if you move to outside of the healthcare provider setting, you think about warehouses, distributors, wholesalers distributing equipment all over the world, and being able to more effectively, efficiently track those supplies as they move in and out of their warehouses. Again, today, a lot of that is manual. A lot of that could be automated with the use of RAIN RFID technology in that the middle part of the supply chain, if you will.
Yeah, I think that's super interesting, and I think a super interesting example of how sort of supply chain and clinical functions too are related to each other, in fact, one another. Well, I think that's all the time we have for today. But I really appreciate the conversation. I thought this was really helpful, really illuminating look into supply chain visibility and kind of some of the trends there and some of the possibilities. So thank you so much, Sandy, for joining me on the show today. This has been Medically Necessary. Thank you for watching. If you want to catch us, we'll be up again. The next episode will be available on Thursday.
Thanks again to our sponsor, Ryder, for making this show possible. The coronavirus pandemic has changed many aspects of the healthcare supply chain, but Ryder is prepared to help customers respond to these changes by offering solutions through the full supply chain. Discover how Ryder can make you ever better at Ryder.com.